"Sue me if you can," the executive laughed, pointing across the table at the old woman sitting quietly at the edge of the room. Nobody in that room took her seriously. Nobody even looked at her twice. But when the doors opened 20 minutes later, every single person in that room understood in an instant that they had made the most expensive mistake of their lives. But let's go back to where it all began. Because before those doors opened and changed everything, there was a woman who had been waiting for this moment for 3 years, and her name was Dorothy Mensah. The law firm of Hargrove and Steele occupied the entire 38th floor of the Meridian Tower. It was the kind of place that communicated power before you even sat down. The reception desk was marble. The chairs were leather. The view from the conference room stretched across the city like a promise that only certain people were allowed to keep. Everyone who worked there knew it. Everyone who visited there felt it. And on a Tuesday morning in late October, Dorothy Mensah felt none of it. She arrived at 9:47, 13 minutes before the scheduled meeting. She wore a plain navy dress, modest and clean but not expensive. Her shoes were flat and practical. Her bag was the kind of bag you find in a church bazaar. Soft fabric, worn handles, a small wooden button at the clasp. She carried no laptop. She carried no folder. She carried nothing that said she belonged in a place like this. The receptionist looked up at her with the particular expression that certain people reserved for those they have already decided do not belong.
"Can I help you?" she asked, in a tone that meant the opposite. "I have a meeting," Dorothy said. "Conference room B, 10 o'clock. The receptionist checked her screen slowly, the way people do when they are hoping not to find what they are looking for. She found it. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted almost imperceptibly. "Take a seat," she said. "Someone will come for you." Dorothy sat. She folded her hands in her lap and waited with the particular stillness of a woman who had learned long ago that patience was not weakness, it was strategy. Richard Steele arrived at 10:08. He did not apologize for being late. He walked into the conference room the way men like Richard Steele always walked into rooms, like the room had been waiting for him specifically and was grateful he had finally arrived. He was 51 years old, silver-haired, and had spent the last 28 years building one of the most feared litigation firms in the state. He had won cases that should not have been winnable. He had buried disputes that should have destroyed his clients. He was not a man who lost. He was not a man who expected to lose, and he certainly had not expected Dorothy Mensah. He paused when he saw her sitting at the far end of the conference table. Not a pause of recognition, a pause of mild confusion, the kind you feel when something is slightly out of place and you cannot immediately identify what it is. "Is she in the wrong room?" he murmured to his associate. His associate checked his tablet quietly. "No, sir, she's the opposing party." Richard Steele looked at Dorothy Mensah for a long moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Not a full smile, something smaller and more dangerous than a smile. He sat down. He opened his leather folder. He did not greet her. The dispute had begun 3 years earlier. Dorothy Mensah had owned a small piece of land on the eastern edge of the city. It had been in her family for 47 years, purchased by her late father with savings that had taken him 11 years to build. When the Caldwell Development Group had begun their expansion project in that district, they had approached Dorothy with an offer. She had declined. They had offered more. She had declined again. And then, quietly, without her knowledge, without her consent, and without anything that remotely resembled legal process, they had built anyway. A retaining wall, then a drainage system, then a service road, each one slightly further onto her land, each one presented afterward as a misunderstanding, an error, an oversight that would of course be corrected. None of it was ever corrected. When Dorothy had engaged a local attorney, Caldwell's legal team had responded swiftly and without mercy. They filed counterclaims. They questioned her title documents. They buried her small legal team in paperwork that would have taken years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to answer. And when her attorney withdrew, overwhelmed and underfunded, Dorothy had found herself alone. That was when she had written the letter. A simple letter, handwritten on plain paper, sent to Hargrove and Steele directly, not to a junior associate, not to the public inquiries desk, to Richard Steele himself. He had not responded. His office had responded 2 weeks later with a single paragraph letter informing Mrs. Mensah that the firm represented Caldwell Development Group and that any further correspondence should be directed through proper legal channels. Dorothy had read that letter twice. Then she had folded it neatly, placed it in her worn fabric bag, and begun making her own calls. That had been 8 months ago. Now she sat across from Richard Steele in his own conference room, on his own floor, in the building that his name was on, and she sat with the same quiet hands and steady eyes she had carried it in with her. Richard's associate slid a document across the table toward her. "Mrs. Mensah, we've asked you here today to discuss a settlement framework. Caldwell is prepared to offer—" "I'm not here to settle," Dorothy said. The associate stopped. Richard Steele looked up from his folder for the first time. "I beg your pardon?" the associate said. "I said I'm not here to settle," Dorothy repeated, her voice carrying the particular softness of someone who does not need volume to be heard. "I'm here because I wanted to deliver something in person." Richard Steele leaned back in his chair slowly. He studied her the way a man studies something he finds mildly entertaining but not threatening. "Mrs. Mensah," he said with the practiced patience of a man who charges $900 an hour, "I understand this process has been difficult, but I want you to understand something clearly. Caldwell has resources that are considerable." He paused, choosing his word the way you choose a tool you are certain will work. "The documentation they have filed creates a legal landscape that would be, frankly, very difficult for an unrepresented party to navigate." Dorothy nodded slowly. "I understand." "Good," Richard said. He picked up his pen. "So let's talk about what a reasonable settlement looks like and how we can bring this matter to a close in a way that works for everyone." "I told you," Dorothy said again, calmly, without blinking, "I'm not settling." Richard Steele put his pen down. The patience in his face thinned just slightly at the edges, the way ice thins when the temperature shifts by 1 degree. "Mrs. Mensah," he said, and now his voice had a different quality to it. "I have been practicing law for nearly 3 decades. I have handled cases significantly more complex than this one. I want to be direct with you so that there is no confusion about where this goes if we cannot reach an agreement today." He leaned forward slightly. "Caldwell will litigate, fully, completely, and without hesitation. The cost of that process for an unrepresented party would be—" he let the pause sit in the room like a weight— "devastating." Dorothy looked at him. She held his gaze without strain, without anger, without the slightest tremor of uncertainty. "I know," she said simply. Richard Steele smiled then, the full smile this time, the smile of a man who believes he has already won. "Then I strongly suggest you reconsider the settlement offer, Mrs. Mensah, because I promise you, if you walk out of this room today without signing, what comes next will be something you are not prepared for." He gestured lightly toward the door. "And if you feel the need to call someone, a family member, an advisor, whoever you like, please go right ahead. But I'll tell you now," he leaned back and folded his arms, the smile still sitting on his face like something permanent, "sue me if you can." Several of the associates around the table looked away. Dorothy Mensah did not look away. She reached into her worn fabric bag slowly. She removed not a phone, not a folder, a single sealed envelope. She placed it on the cable and slid it gently toward the center. "I already did," she said quietly. The room stilled. Richard Steele's smile held for exactly 3 more seconds. Then something behind it shifted. He looked at the envelope. He looked at his associate. His associate looked at the envelope with an expression that Richard Steele had never seen on his associate's face before in 11 years of working together. Something close to alarm. "What is this?" Richard said. "Open it," Dorothy said. His associate reached forward and broke the seal. He removed the documents inside. He read the first page, then he read it again. Then he set it down very carefully on the table, the way you set something down when you are trying to decide how to say what you have just read. "Sir," he said quietly, "What is it?" Richard said, his voice still controlled, still certain, but something underneath it had begun to move like ground shifting before it breaks. His associate slid the document toward him without another word. Richard Steele read. The room watched him read, and the room watched something happen to his face that the associates in that room would speak about quietly among themselves for years afterward, not loudly, not with pleasure, but with the particular reverence people reserve for moments they witnessed that they could not fully explain. The document was a federal civil rights filing. Not a local complaint, not a standard land dispute, a fully prepared, comprehensively documented federal case, citing a pattern of predatory land acquisition targeting elderly landowners of color across 4 counties over 11 years. Dorothy Mensah's land was not the only one. It was the 37th. The filing named Caldwell Development Group as the primary respondent. It named Hargrove and Steele as the legal instrument through which the acquisitions had been facilitated, and it had been filed 6 days ago by one of the most respected civil rights law firms in the country, working on Dorothy Mensah's behalf, pro bono, after she had sent them a letter, a handwritten letter on plain paper. Richard Steele set the document down.
He did not speak. For the first time in 28 years of filling conference rooms with his certainty, Richard Steele had nothing to say. The doors opened. 3 attorneys walked in. Not young associates, senior partners carrying their own sealed folders, moving with the quiet confidence of people who had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. They nodded to Dorothy. They took seats beside her without hurry, without drama, without a single word directed at Richard Steele. Dorothy Mensah folded her hands on the table. She looked at Richard Steele with the same steady, unhurried eyes she had carried into this room 40 minutes ago. "My husband bought that land with 11 years of savings," she said quietly. "He is gone now, but what he built for our family does not go with him. It stays, and it will be protected." She reached into her bag once more and placed a second envelope on the table. "That is our counterfiling," she said. "You have 14 days to respond." She stood. She picked up her worn fabric bag, adjusted it on her shoulder with the same unhurried movement she had used when she arrived, and walked toward the door. If this story moved something in you, please subscribe to our channel so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for watching.